Morning, church.
Morning.
The last thing that was on the board said, welcome, we're glad you're here. And we are glad you're here. I'm going to take a piece, I'm going to take a little thing from Mark. I don't do PowerPoints, so you just got to listen to me, okay? Nothing to read. There's no funnies or anything on the screen. So, when Tom went on vacation, he asked for a couple elders to step in and help him out, and Mark and I decided to do that. And 2 or 3 times now I've tried to speak on, just share a little bit about Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, somebody I really respect what he went through. And then I would try and put something together and it didn't work, and the next thing I know I just had some random thoughts in my heart and in my head, and that's what I shared on. And it was okay, but I feel that God did give me the opportunity to share Nehemiah this week. And the reason I'm saying that is Pam was going through some old notebooks. Some of them were mine, some were hers. And she found one notebook that had 1 page of some things I had learned at a men's group. I believe it was a men's group. Years ago. And it's like, well, maybe I should just take that and run with it. And then as I started praying about it, it's like, I could take these 7 or 8 notes that I had on 1 page, and I could tie those into Nehemiah. So it was kind of neat that I get to share some of the notes from things I've learned in a class, in a group, and what I've read in the Bible. So Lord, I just ask you to keep my thoughts clear today. Lord, we have asked you to help us go deep and to step out of our comfort zone. And sometimes I feel that's what I'm doing when I'm up here. But Lord, just keep me focused on you, and you'll find out in the end of this message that Nehemiah was focused on Jesus. Was focused on God. But I got to believe that even back then, Jesus was present. So Lord, thank you, and guide my words today. In Jesus' name. So Nehemiah, he led the 3rd return of the Jewish exiles back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city walls. First came Zerubbabel, and he orchestrated rebuilding the temple. And then Ezra came, and he dealt with the people of Jerusalem. But then things took a turn, and the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed. The gates were burned with fire. And Nehemiah shows what I say is a perfect illustration of biblical balance between prayer and action. And the important thing in that statement was prayer came before action. So Nehemiah heard from one of his brothers in a group that had survived the exile, and he heard that the walls of Jerusalem had been destroyed, and it lay in ruin. And it was causing great trouble and disgrace. The people of God, their city was falling apart. And of course, Assyrians and some of the others, they just thought that was a fine thing. And Nehemiah was distraught when he heard this. He wept, he mourned, he fasted, he prayed. He prayed to the God of heaven. And that's where I think Jesus was sitting right there with the Father. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer, King Artaxerxes' cupbearer. So he didn't have any issues. He had a good job. He had security. He could have easily said to his brother and the others that were with him, I'll pray for you when I get a chance or when I remember to. But that's not the kind of man that Nehemiah was. Nehemiah cared deeply, and he trusted God fully. And I trust God, but I know I'm nowhere near the fully part yet. But Nehemiah was. He fasted and prayed when he heard this news for 4 months. 4 months, just constant prayer and fasting. I'm lucky if I can go 3 days praying for the same thing, for the same person or the same event before I get tired and move on to something else. I'll probably go back to that original thing, but to carry it on for 4 months, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how he did that. So one of the notes on my sheet says, to get somewhere, you first have to get up and go. And when Nehemiah spent 4 months fasting and praying, he was prepared to go. And when God's timing was right, he took wine, as was his job, into the king, and he was sad. He was kind of just not the usual fellow that the king would see. And the king inquired of him, "Why are you sad?" And he basically told the king, "Would you not be sad if the walls of your city were in collapse and the gates had been burned and people are in trouble?" And the king, I'm sure nodded and said, "Well, I guess you've got a right to be sad." And then Nehemiah asked if he could go to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. He didn't tell him he'd been praying about it. He just asked. God spurred Nehemiah to ask him, "Can I go?" And the king asked him, "How long? How long are you going to be gone?" And Nehemiah had an answer. I don't exactly know what that answer is, but I do know he was gone for years before he went back to be a cupbearer. So the king basically gave him approval to go. And then Nehemiah had the foresight from prayer to ask for some things. He asked for documents from the king to provide safe travel across the regions. And he asked for documents to provide materials from the keeper of the forest so he could get the timber. And he asked for personnel to help in this undertaking. And God sent him with men. God sent him with an army regimen and horses and men. And he went. And he went and he was protected because he was prepared, and God had worked on Artaxerxes' heart when he asked about this thing. So as he's going, the second thing on my list here, it says, beware of sleeping dogs. Don't be intimidated. And as word spread that he was going to Jerusalem, there were people who were already rising up. The enemy already had people put in his way, and they weren't physically trying to take him out at that time, but they were just they were there as something on your shoulder, your conscience, just something talking to him. And I call the three dogs. There's 3 sleeping dogs. I call them. Their names are Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And they were all enemies of Israel. And when they heard about his plan, they started to plot against him. But it was of no avail. It wasn't any good because God's hand was in this, because Nehemiah prayed and fasted before. If he'd have just gone and even had some soldiers from the king and gone, they could have caused a lot of turmoil for him. But since he was walking in the blessing of God, and this was as much God's vision as it was Nehemiah's, they couldn't do anything because the job in front of him, they made several attempts and they were thwarted every time because prayer. And one of the things that I noted as I'm looking at this, reading through this again, is Nehemiah always prays that God would remember what he did, what he asked. And he was seeking approval from one person, one entity. He was seeking that from God. He didn't care what man said. He didn't care what the king said. He was more concerned about how he stood before God, not before man. So as he goes along his way and he gets to Jerusalem, Nehemiah went to Jerusalem and he set out to inspect the walls and the gates of the city. He stayed there for 3 days and then he went out on his own. He took a few men with him, but no one knew what his plans were. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing. And he walked the whole gate in the whole city just to see how bad it was, what he had to do. And still no one knew why he was doing this. I don't think he had a scribe writing down that, we need timbers here, we need a stone here, he wasn't doing that. He was just going to look and see the condition of the city that he loved. His forefathers were buried there. It was just a holy place for the Jewish nation, and it was in disrepair, and he was looking to see how bad it was. Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, the sleeping dogs, ridiculed him and asked him, "Are you rebelling against the king?" Nehemiah answered that the God of heaven will give us success, but you dogs will have no place, no claim, or no historic right to the city of Jerusalem. So he was claiming back what God had set aside years ago, many years ago. And basically it's almost like today. God's got Israel, and other people want to take claim to it. And I'm not going to be political, but I just believe that God gave that piece of earth to his people, and it's going to stay to his people. So after he'd done his inspection, he gathered the priests and leaders and he shared his vision, which was God's vision, and all agreed to start working on the wall and the gates. And believe it or not, there were 42 different groups that started to work to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They were leaders, priests, servants, goldsmiths, merchants, children, women, musicians. They all took a chunk of the wall near the place where they lived. And what I think is, what I see is that being familiar with today is that a lot of those people didn't have a clue how to lay a beam, how to drill a hole. They were musicians. They were kids. No disrespect. They were women. They were priests. Priests never got dirty. They would have known nothing about that. So what that tells me is that even in today's age, when we're looking to rebuild the church or help work in the church, do things in the church, every one of us can have a hand in it, even if we're unskilled, because God can give you the ability to do something to help someone. Because the carpenters have helpers. The masonry guys have helpers. Everyone can play a role in rebuilding today's church. It just doesn't have to be skilled trades. So just think about that when someone at the pulpit here or just someone in a meeting you're at asks for some help to do something. Don't shy back and just shake your head like you can't do anything, because if you're willing, God will let you. He'll let you help. He'll be glad to have you help. There is a place for all of us to be involved in building God's church. So as they're building, I see that the next note says, build things that last, not that look pretty. I mean, in our day and age, if we build something, we want it to be nice. We don't want paint lapping over one board to the next. We want the colors to be right. We want the shingles to be square, and we just want it to look good. Put a flower on the front door. That's not the thing. The thing is, you've got to build things to last. The main foundation in Jerusalem was still pretty much intact, but the waste and the rubble that was in the way, it had to be removed so the walls could be rebuilt. And I think it was Tobiah who said to Sanballat, the way they're going to build those walls, if a fox runs up that wall, it's going to collapse. And Nehemiah is just chuckling because he knows that's not going to happen, because we're doing this the right way and we're building it to last. When the walls were about half its height, the dogs rose up again, halfway up all the way around. Nehemiah and the people prayed to God and set guards out day and night, because they just felt that they were going to be attacked from the outside. And as this building's going on, the people are living inside the walls that they're building. The people that don't have a right to the place are outside. And so they set guards to watch, to repel any threat. And from that time on, when the walls got halfway built, half of the men and the workers, the women, everyone, half of them worked every day, and the other half stood guard behind them with their weapons of war to repel anyone who tried to get in. And by now, the dogs are getting pretty frustrated because they're seeing that there's no holes left in these walls. All the walls are being built at the same time with all these groups. And that's just an amazing thing to me, that all these groups are working together and they're staying kind of on track, and they're all taking care of their section, and it's being built in a timely manner. In spite of all the attacks on Nehemiah, they attacked him personally, and there were enemies, there was corruption. Even when you're doing a good thing like that, there are people in there that say they believe in God and they're doing what he wants, but under the table or behind the back, they're dealing with someone else. So the corruption that went on, the enemies, the wall of Jerusalem, the whole wall of Jerusalem was rebuilt in 52 days. It's an amazing thing to think that the city, the size of Jerusalem, and when they got done and counted after they were all done, there were almost 50,000 people in that city. So I'll be like, I don't want to say Akron, but even like take a place like Kent and decide you're going to build a wall around the city of Kent, and you're going to do it in 52 days. And it's going to be sturdy. and it's not going to fail. All I can say is God must have helped the Jews build that building, build those walls. And he can still do things like that with our help. He needs our hands. He wants our hands. He doesn't need our hands. He wants our hands. He wants our skills. And if we can do that, we can let our enemies see that God's involved with what they're doing. I can try and disturb it, but it's not going to work because their God is a great God. He's alive and working still here today. The three dogs again schemed against Nehemiah. And they just aren't happy. Even though the walls are up and the doors are set, they're still not happy. And they sent him messages that he responded to. They sent him 4 messages to have him come out and meet them in a village. Just come out and let's talk about this. And he always told them that he's doing a great project and I can't come down to meet you. Then the 5th letter that came, Sanballat put in a personal note sealed to Nehemiah, and it said that he felt, I think it was Geshem, had suggested that the Jews were going to be revolting, and that Nehemiah would be named king. And as far as they were concerned, they already had a king. And Nehemiah replied to them a little different than what he did the first time. The first time he says, I'm busy doing a great project, I can't come. Now he says, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are making it up in your head. Not to be political, but does that sound familiar? I mean, it sounds familiar. And I'm not taking it right or wrong way, but it just goes to show you that nothing new goes on now that hasn't gone on since before Jesus' time. It's the same corruption. It's the same scheming. There is nothing different. It's all a little bit of the same. Another one of my notes said, fill yourself with the right things or you will eat anything. And I wondered where that fit in. And then as I'm reading a little more, Nehemiah ended up being named governor of the region for a period. And Artaxerxes sent a governor's bounty. He sent food, he sent money, he sent things to the governor, but Nehemiah wouldn't take it. Even though it was from someone he knew, he wouldn't take it. So he took of his own supply, an ox and some sheep and some poultry and wine, and he took it all from his own and his own group's gatherings, and he had 150 people at his dinner table every night, and they were just different people. They were nobles, they were priests, they were just simple people. There were people traveling that he invited in the walls, and he ate, and he cooked. They say that he cooked an ox, 4 sheep, and poultry every night for that dinner. And it went on for weeks and weeks. But he never touched what the governor sent, because he felt the governor was getting that from the people, and he wasn't taking that from the governor because he knew what the people were struggling with. and, he wasn't taking their, what they were given the government. Am I God's grateful child? Who do I sit with? That's my next one. And Nehemiah sat with the people from his city. He sat with the priest. He did sit with visitors. But he wasn't sitting with the 3 sleeping dogs outside. They were still outside. They still didn't like the fact they were outside. But that's where they were, and he wasn't letting them in because they had no right to the place. After things are moving, they're settled in, they're moving along, and life seems to be at a good balance in Jerusalem, Nehemiah returns to the king. Because at the beginning he told him he'd come back. And he had a time frame. And God fulfilled that time frame and allowed him to go back and serve the king again. He got his old job back. So he got his job back, he got his security back. He was probably in pretty good shape and pretty happy. But shortly after he was back, he hears about the corruption starting where he had just left. And he spent some time with the king, and then again he couldn't take it because that's his homeland, that's his home. And he again requested leave, and he returned to Jerusalem. When he got there, he saw houses in the temple, rooms in the temple being used to store monies and grains and things that shouldn't have been there. There are people outside the gates that are selling their wares on the Sabbath, and he really had a problem with that. And so he dealt with all that and cleaned things up. He reestablished principle and righteousness to Jerusalem. And that's where he spent the majority of his time after that. It doesn't sound like he ever went back to the king, back to the safety of the job that he had. But he stayed right where he felt God wanted him to be, amongst his people. There was one, I told you earlier, there was one prayer that Nehemiah asked a lot. And when I first going through this, reading this, and it's like, this guy really wants God to remember who he is. And then as I'm reading a little bit more, his prayer says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not of my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offices thereof." And that was after he went back and saw the corruption and tried to cleanse and straighten things back out. And then he prays to God. But he prays this prayer a lot. Don't forget me. And then when I'm in one of the study Bibles that I'm using, there's a comment at the bottom of the page, and it says, remember me for this, O my God." This clause recurs throughout the book of Nehemiah. It helps explain why Nehemiah the man made such a difference in his time. Throughout the book, Nehemiah lived to receive one vote of approval. He could stand against the enemies from outside and inside the walls. He could revive the revival, even if doing so meant making more enemies. He looked only to God for a nod of approval, and his recurring prayer was answered. So all he was doing was just, I think it was more for himself than to ask God. It was more of a confirmation to him. God, remember what I'm doing. I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this for your glory. So it just, that really got me, and it changed the way I was thinking about it, because there for a while it was like, man, get off yourself. All the good things you're doing, but don't turn it to yourself. And then I realized at the end of the book that it wasn't about him. It was about his approval from God. That's what he was looking for. God, just let me know that I'm doing the right thing. Encourage me. Let me know that you love me because you're allowing me to succeed. So all I can say is we should only be dependent on one, and that's God. And we have jobs, we have spouses, we have families, we have different responsibilities, and it's good to have approval from those people because you're living with them, but sometimes approval with someone you live with is not the right kind of approval. The approval you want to seek is that from God. Then I just had a couple more little notes that I didn't get to fit in to the scripture, but I just really felt they were pertinent. I mean, as I went down this whole list. And this one hit me. It says, the face of Jesus is the face of a servant. And when I read that again, it's like, that was Nehemiah. And that's why I think Jesus was there when he was praying and fasting and seeking God. I got to believe that Jesus was right there next to him. I mean, Jesus just didn't appear at Christmas. Jesus has been with the Father all along. And the Father was the Spirit. And I think Jesus is the flesh, and he was there. So I think he was the one that was encouraging Nehemiah. I mean, God's blessing was all over Nehemiah, but Jesus, I think, was the one who was giving him the encouragement to do this. So when I think about that, I think, yeah, Jesus was there. He was there during this. He might not have been in the flesh yet, but he had his hand all over this. And another note I have says, Jesus is still the water of life in a dry land. And we saw that when he came down to earth and walked and basically said he was the water. Drink of me, never be thirsty. And that's still pertinent, but I still think that it goes way back. I think it goes back 450 years before he came down, that he was providing the refreshment that Nehemiah needed. He was Nehemiah's water. Laura, if you want to come on up. The last note I have on my page says, the gospel does not need our help. It only needs our voice. So it's not, we can't do anything to improve on the gospel. I wouldn't even think about trying to do that. But we can be the voice that carries it out and shares. And since we all have a role to play in building this church, not just this building, but building the church universal, we just need to be the voice of God to take. And I really believe that when people see that walked out, the voice of God, when you're speaking, when you're just acting, when you're doing something, that I really, people I don't think would acknowledge it, but I really do feel that people say, see God's hand in what they're doing. And a lot of times they won't acknowledge it because they don't like it. But they have to acknowledge the fact that He's involved. He's all over it. He's all over everything we do. And He doesn't get tired of it. And He just keeps on loving us, encouraging us. Jesus keeps giving us something to drink. The Holy Spirit just keeps prodding in our ear, talking to us a little bit of, good choice, not so good choice. Try this. Let's do that. So if we just listen, we're going to see it all. We're going to see God's hand all over our lives. And we'll come to enjoy it. We'll come to like it. When you come to like it, then you start experiencing it. Then you're not afraid to go deep because it's not dark down there. And you're willing to step out. You're willing to step out in your work boots, not in your soft-soled slippers, and just where you're comfortable in front of the fire. He just wants us to get out there. He wants us to let us see what will happen if we allow Him in. So let's invite Him in.
All things have passed away. Your love has stayed the same. Your constant grace remains the cornerstone. Things that we thought were dead are breathing in life again. You cause your sun
I was studying for this message, and I'm so thankful for Pastor Tom and the words that he gives and he does this week after week after week. And when we get a chance to step up the bat once in a while, you'll look a little deeper in the book than you do when you're just reading it normally. And I've come to realize that, as I said just a couple minutes ago, I think Jesus had his hand in a whole lot of things a lot before we thought. That he was with the Father, he was one with the Father, and I really think that all throughout history, he's been involved. But all you heard was God. You heard God because Jesus hadn't come into the world yet. But now that we know that he's been here, we can look back and we can see. We can see the role he played in this world coming. So Lord, I just thank you. Thank you for allowing me to explore this and share it. And Lord, I just challenge us to find our niche, to find that spot where we can help and we can work to build the kingdom more and more. And whether it be something as small as working in the back with Chris at the hub, or on an outreach, or on a missions trip, or just being that light of the world in the place where you work, where you go to school, where you grocery shop, whatever. Just let your light shine through us and shine on us. There's a big difference between God's light shining on you and God's light shining out from you. Because if it's coming out from you, that means he's dwelling in there. He can turn that three-way bulb up anytime he wants. Click, 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 and make you shine a little bit brighter. So that's what I want. I want to be 200 watts all the time. Okay, God, 200 watts. So Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for the worship. It's wonderful. Just love this church so much. And if you want to come forward, if anyone wants to come forward for prayer, we'll pray if you have a need, but we'll also pray that fears of being in the dark and going deep can go away. And we'll pray that we can get you a pair of work boots instead of slippers. And we'll pray that you can experience that what God has for you. So thank you for coming today. Have a great week. Be released in Jesus' name.